You think black mothers shared every recipe with eager hands? Think again. Some dishes were guarded like family secrets, passed down only through whispered instructions and watchful eyes in the kitchen. Here are 60 cheap recipes black mothers refused to share until now. Sweet corn and onion skillet was the kind of dish that came together quickly, made from what the garden and pantry had to offer. Fresh ears of corn, or sometimes canned when the season had passed, were sliced from the cob and tossed into a hot pan with sliced onions. Lard or bacon fat did the work of bringing flavor, sizzling until the onions browned and the corn caramelized. The smell was sweet and smoky, filling the house with a promise of comfort even before the first bite. It was cheap, it was fast, and it was nourishing, the kind of supper that stretched across countless families trying to make ends meet. My grandmother served it with bread or cornbread, letting the skillet's juices soak into every bite. The simplicity was its strength, just vegetables and fat, transformed into something more than the sum of its parts. Sweet corn and onion skillet reminded everyone that even with little, you could still eat well. Creole tomato sandwiches turned a hot summer harvest into a cool lunch that defined garden eating across the Gulf Coast. Thick slices of sun-ripened Creole tomatoes, their juices bright and sweet, were layered on soft white bread spread generously with homemade mayonnaise. A sprinkle of salt and cracked black pepper was all that was needed to let the fruit's rich flavor shine. Families in New Orleans and along the Louisiana bayous prized these tomatoes for their deep red flesh and vibrant taste, planting them in backyard plots and city gardens alike. During the Civil Rights era, these sandwiches appeared at rallies and porch gatherings, offering a refreshing bite that required no stove and almost no effort. Each sandwich dripped with the essence of summer and the comfort of something grown close to home. As hybrid tomatoes and supermarket produce replaced heirloom varieties, the distinctive Creole flavor became rare. Today, the sandwich survives mostly as a nostalgic memory of hot afternoons, community gardens, and the simple pleasure of bread, tomato, and mayonnaise eaten while the cicadas hummed. Chicken wing stew was one of those meals that would surprise modern ears, since wings were once the cheapest part of the bird. My grandmother bought them in bulk when she could, piling them into pots with onions, celery, and carrots. Slowly simmered, the wings gave up their fat and flavor, turning thin broth into rich gravy. She thickened it with flour or cornstarch, serving it hot over rice or bread to stretch it even further. It was messy eating, but no one complained because the taste was so comforting. Wings may be prized today, but in the 1960s they were scraps, turned into nourishment by clever hands. She said every part of the bird had value if you treated it with respect. Chicken wing stew carried the spirit of thrift, transforming what others dismissed into something that filled the house with warmth. It was proof that good cooking did not depend on wealth, only patience and care. Gizzards and rice were the meal that taught flavor from labor. Tough at first, the gizzards demanded patience, cleaned, boiled, and seasoned before ever touching the skillet. Grandparents fried them slow with onions, letting the scent of pepper and grease build into something irresistible. Once tender, they met a pot of rice, plain but proud, soaking up all that savory juice. It was not fancy, but it was rich in spirit, feeding families that refused to waste a thing. Gizzards, the part most people threw away, became the centerpiece of a dinner that stuck to the ribs. The sound of the knife chopping, the hiss of the pan, the quiet hum of the stove, all of it felt like music in a home where nothing came easy but everything was earned. It was dinner built from wisdom, not wealth. Each bite carried gratitude and grit, proof that poverty never lacked flavor. Fried cornmeal mush was proof that breakfast didn't need money to taste good. It began with leftover grits or cornmeal porridge, cooled overnight until firm. The next morning, it was sliced thick and fried in a bit of grease until each piece turned golden and crisp on the outside, soft and creamy inside. Mothers served it with syrup, molasses, or gravy depending on what the day called for. The crackle of cornmeal in the pan was the sound of thrift at work, using what was left to make something new again. It filled bellies before long walks to school or shifts at work, giving warmth that stuck through the morning. Fried cornmeal mush wasn't just a dish. It was a rhythm, a morning ritual built from yesterday's effort. It made sure nothing went to waste, and everyone started the day with something to smile about. Sweet, savory, or somewhere in between, it was a small joy that cost almost nothing but meant everything. Okra fritters with cornmeal batter were a civil rights-era street food that brought communities together with a crisp bite and a burst of garden flavor. Fresh okra pods were sliced into thin rounds and stirred into a seasoned cornmeal batter with just enough buttermilk to hold everything together. Hot cast iron skillets of shimmering oil transformed the mixture into golden patties that sizzled and popped, releasing a savory aroma that drew crowds from blocks away. These fritters appeared at roadside stands, church fish fries, and grassroots rallies where neighbors gathered to share food and strength during uncertain times. The outside formed a crunchy crust, while the inside stayed tender and lightly sweet, letting the okra's earthy taste shine through. Served with a dash of hot sauce or a spoon of homemade relish, they were quick to cook and easy to share. As convenience foods and chain restaurants spread, this simple treat lost ground, but its memory lingers as a symbol of resilience, hospitality, and the power of a shared skillet meal during years of struggle and hope across the American South. Homemade cornmeal pancakes for supper were another way families stretched basic ingredients into a filling meal. Flour, cornmeal, lard, and milk came together in a batter that fried into golden cakes on a hot skillet. My grandmother served them stacked, drizzled with syrup if any was available, or eaten plain with butter when syrup was gone. The pancakes were fluffy yet hearty, giving enough energy to hold a family until morning. They cost next to nothing but fed many, which was exactly what mattered most. Children loved the sweetness when syrup was added, while adults appreciated the sheer substance of the cakes. In the 1960s, cornmeal pancakes were a staple when meat was scarce, turning humble ingredients into something warm and reliable. It was comfort food born of necessity, one of those meals that never left memory even as times changed. Homemade cornmeal pancakes carried the spirit of thrift, filling plates with love and survival. Collard greens with ham hocks simmered slow and proud, the pot working as long as the day. Grandparents washed each leaf by hand, folding them into the pot with care. The ham hock gave just enough salt and smoke to flavor every bite. The greens wilted down into something tender, deep, and full of life. The smell filled the house, steady and strong, like a heartbeat. Cornbread waited nearby to soak up the potlikker, the broth rich with flavor and history. This was food that comforted, that healed, that reminded families where they came from. It was simple, but it carried power, and that made it sacred. Collard greens with ham hocks were a hymn cooked in a pot, a prayer whispered over the stove. Grandparents taught the younger ones to taste the broth before it finished, adding a pinch of pepper or vinegar if needed. Everyone had their own way of making it, but the feeling was always the same. The greens brought people together over stories, songs, and shared plates. Eating them was more than habit, it was heritage. In every spoonful was the echo of hands that had picked, washed, and cooked for generations before. Eggshell pudding was an act of pure ingenuity, a sweet custard built from things no one thought could be used. Families saved eggshells, washed and dried them, then ground them into powder for extra calcium. That powder went into milk, sugar, and cornstarch, stirred together until it thickened over the stove. It set in jars or bowls, smooth and pale, a dessert that looked humble but held the taste of patience. It was soft, slightly sweet, and carried the faint scent of vanilla if a family could afford it. Children thought it was magic, how scraps turned into something good. It filled more than bellies. It filled hearts with gratitude. Eggshell pudding was the promise that nothing had to go to waste, that even the smallest fragments had purpose. In every spoonful was the spirit of endurance, a quiet hymn to survival sung right from the kitchen stove. Sweet corn spoonbread emerged from church suppers and family reunions as a dish that blended Native American corn traditions with Southern creativity. Freshly ground cornmeal and whole kernels were whisked into a custard of milk, eggs, and a knob of butter, then baked until the edges set while the center stayed soft and almost pudding-like. Served hot straight from the oven, it needed nothing more than a pat of butter melting across the top to make everyone at the table smile. Children loved its sweetness, adults loved its gentle richness, and cooks loved how forgiving it was when made in a hurry. Spoon bread appeared at potlucks that doubled as strategy meetings, where activists gathered for strength and neighbors shared what they could. It was inexpensive yet festive, a dish that welcomed everyone to take a big spoonful and feel at home. As instant mixes and boxed cornbread gained popularity, the slow-baked spoon bread quietly disappeared, but the memory of its creamy texture and golden aroma still evokes the spirit of generosity and unity that defined the era's most important gathering. Fried bream with hush puppies was a meal born from rivers, ponds, and hands that knew how to fish. Bream, small and plentiful, cost little more than the time spent catching them. My grandmother cleaned the fish, rolled them in cornmeal, and fried them crisp in hot oil until the skin crackled golden brown. Hush puppies bubbled alongside, little cornmeal fritters that were cheap to mix and cooked quickly. Together, they made a dinner that felt rich without draining a wallet. Families gathered around plates piled high, dipping hush puppies into hot sauce or eating them plain while the fish cooled. The taste was pure Southern tradition, simple, salty, and tied to the land and water. In the 1960s, when grocery stores were expensive, fishing poles and cast nets provided meals for families who had little to spare. Fried bream with hush puppies was more than food. It was a reminder of resourcefulness and community, where the catch of the day fed everyone at the table. Turkey necks with gravy turned what many ignored into something worth craving. Grandparents browned the necks first, letting them sizzle in a pan until the air filled with a smoky richness. A bit of flour, water, and thyme turned the drippings into thick brown gravy that coated every piece like velvet. The meat cooked for hours until it slipped clean off the bone, tender and rich with flavor. Served over rice or mashed potatoes, it looked simple but tasted like a feast. The necks may have been cheap, but the love behind them was priceless. Grandparents made the most of what they had, and this meal proved their creativity and care. The gravy was the best part, seasoned just right, spooned generously so nothing went to waste. Everyone at the table ate slow, grateful for the warmth, the smell, and the moment. It was Sunday flavor on a weekday budget, the taste of making do without feeling poor. Turkey necks with gravy were more than a meal. They were a celebration of resilience and resourcefulness that lived in every kitchen where pride cooked alongside hunger. Rice and molasses supper was one of the simplest meals, but also one of the most remembered. A pot of rice was inexpensive, filling, and always on hand, but paired with a drizzle of molasses, it turned into something sweet and sustaining. Sugar was too costly for everyday use, but molasses was affordable and sold in larger tins that seemed to last forever. Families poured it over steaming bowls of rice, letting the dark syrup seep into the grains until they gleamed. The taste was rich, almost smoky, with just enough sweetness to make children smile. It was often eaten at the end of the day when no meat could be spared, and it carried people through the night with enough strength to face the next morning. My grandmother told me rice and molasses was a treat disguised as necessity, proof that resourcefulness could soften the edge of scarcity. In the 1960s, when Black families were stretching every dollar, rice and molasses kept hunger at bay while still offering a touch of comfort. Simple, cheap, and unforgettable, it was a meal born of need but remembered with love. Red rice with smoked sausage brought the flavors of the Gullah Geechee coast to dinner tables from South Carolina to Georgia, blending African techniques with local ingredients in a single bubbling pot. Long grain rice was simmered with tomatoes, onions, peppers, and fragrant spices until each grain absorbed a rich scarlet hue. Slices of smoked sausage added a savory depth and a hint of salt that made the dish satisfying enough to feed a crowd. Families loved it for Sunday suppers and late-night meetings alike because it required only one pan and filled the house with an irresistible aroma. Community cooks carried the recipe to rallies and church fundraisers where its bold color and hearty taste symbolized unity and celebration even in hard times. As processed rice mixes and quick dinners became the norm, authentic red rice slowly faded from everyday menus. What remains is the memory of a communal dish that carried centuries of African influence and a spirit of resilience in every spoonful. Sorghum syrup biscuits with milk were the kind of dinner that showed how families found sweetness even in struggle. Sorghum syrup, cheaper than sugar, was kept in jars that seemed to last forever, poured generously over hot biscuits fresh from the oven. My grandmother baked the biscuits with flour and lard, ingredients that could be stretched and shared across multiple meals. Once the biscuits were ready, she split them open, drizzled them with syrup, and served them with cold milk poured into glasses. It was simple but filling, providing enough energy for tired workers and growing children. The sweetness of the syrup turned plain flour biscuits into something that felt like a treat, even if it was just supper. In the 1960s, this kind of meal reminded families that comfort did not always need meat or elaborate dishes. It was about making do with what was on hand and finding joy in it. Sorghum syrup biscuits with milk were a reminder that sweetness could soften the edge of hardship. Rice and gravy suppers were the soul of weeknight dinners, simple and satisfying. Grandparents browned whatever they had, chicken scraps, neck bones, or even onions alone, to make a base for the gravy. The drippings told the story, turning flour and water into gold. The smell was deep and comforting, rising from the pan like a promise. Hot rice waited patiently in a pot nearby, ready to soak up every drop. It was not fancy, but it was enough to fill every stomach and calm every worry. The first spoonful always tasted like home, salty and rich, carrying the flavor of care. When times were lean, the gravy was thin, but the love stayed thick. Every plate was scraped clean, nothing left behind. It was the dinner that kept families steady, warm, and thankful. Proof that comfort did not need luxury, just a stove, some rice, and a little faith. It fed more than hunger. It fed hope. Grandparents knew that a good pot of gravy could fix most of life's small troubles. Sometimes it was made with leftover roast or chicken drippings saved from the night before. Other times it was built from nothing more than fat and flour, stirred until the color turned perfect. The magic was in the patience, the slow whisk, the right smell, the moment it thickened. In that moment, the kitchen turned into a place of peace. Neckbone stew was a pot of patience and love. Black mothers knew how to take the cheapest cut of meat and turn it into something that could feed everyone. Neck bones were bony, fatty, and far from tender. But slow cooking changed everything. They'd brown them in a heavy pot with onions and garlic, letting the aroma fill the kitchen long before supper was ready. Then came potatoes, carrots, and a sprinkle of whatever spices were on hand, often just salt, pepper, and a hint of bay. The broth thickened slowly, rich with collagen and depth, until every bone gave up its flavor. The meat clung to the bone, tender and silky, floating in a sauce that seemed to hug each vegetable. Children would watch the pot simmer, knowing that when it was done, there'd be enough to go around. In homes where every dollar mattered, this dish proved that care could make abundance out of scarcity. It wasn't fancy, but it was real food, filling, warm, and made to last. Every bowl carried the memory of the cook's hands and the sound of laughter echoing from the table. Carolina Gold Rice Pudding carried the aroma of low-country kitchens where the golden grains of this heirloom rice once ruled family dinners and Sunday suppers. Families simmered the prized rice in fresh milk until it turned tender and creamy, then folded in sugar, butter, and a whisper of nutmeg to create a dessert that felt like a warm embrace. The unique texture of Carolina Gold gave the pudding a silky body that regular long-grain rice could never match, making each spoonful feel both luxurious and familiar. Grandmothers often stirred in a handful of raisins or a splash of vanilla, letting the scent drift through the house while children waited impatiently for the first bite. It was a recipe born from African-American culinary traditions and the coastal fields of South Carolina and Georgia, carrying generations of history in every pot. Over time, the specialized grain nearly disappeared as mass-produced rice took its place, and with it, this beloved pudding faded from tables too. Today, it survives mainly in stories and rare heritage farms, a sweet reminder of a time when simple ingredients and patient stirring turned humble rice into a dessert worth celebrating at every family gathering. Stewed okra with cornmeal dumplings was a dish that blended frugality with comfort in a way that stuck with families for decades. Okra, often grown in backyard gardens, went into a simmering pot with onions, tomatoes, and broth until it softened into a thick stew. My grandmother would mix simple cornmeal batter, drop spoonfuls into the bubbling pot, and let the dumplings cook until they puffed into tender bites. The texture of the okra thickened the stew naturally, giving it body without needing flour or cream. Each bowl carried the flavor of the garden, earthy and sustaining, with dumplings that filled the stomachs of tired workers. It was food that came straight from the soil and stretched further than its ingredients suggested. Children grew up eating this dish as a matter of routine, yet it became part of the rhythm of survival. In the 1960s, stewed okra with cornmeal dumplings was a staple that represented both thrift and ingenuity, turning humble vegetables and flour into something worthy of pride at the dinner table. Fried bologna sandwiches were the weeknight heroes of the kitchen. Bologna hit the hot skillet with a sizzle, the edges curling like petals as it browned. Grandparents flipped each slice just once, careful not to burn the good parts. The smell was sharp, salty, and rich, filling the house faster than the hunger could. White bread waited on the counter, sometimes toasted, sometimes soft, and mustard or hot sauce turned it into magic. When money ran short, this sandwich saved the day. It was fast, filling, and full of character. Kids loved the crunch at the edge, the way the heat softened the bread just enough to make it melt in your hands. Grown folks knew it for what it was, a humble blessing. Fried bologna sandwiches tasted like memory and invention, like comfort built on what little was left. Pinto beans and cornbread was a meal that carried generations. Pinto beans simmered for hours with salt pork or a leftover ham bone until the broth grew thick and smoky. The cornbread baked in cast iron, crisp on the edges and soft in the middle, waiting to soak up every drop. This was more than food. It was a way of surviving with dignity. For many families, a pot of beans could last 2 or 3 days, with each reheating somehow tasting even better. Black mothers made sure the pot never ran dry, stirring as they talked, prayed, or planned the week ahead. Beans filled the home with a smell of comfort and quiet pride. It was protein, flavor, and history, all built from a few cents worth of ingredients. Eating together, they'd crumble cornbread into their bowls, letting it soak until it became a stew of sorts, warm, familiar, sustaining. In that simple mix of beans and bread lived proof that home cooking could be both humble and holy. Chicken and dumpling soup with drop dumplings offered comfort when families needed it most, simmering in countless kitchens during the civil rights era. A whole chicken was boiled with onions, celery, and carrots until the broth turned rich and fragrant, then pulled apart to yield tender pieces of meat. Instead of carefully rolled dough, quick spoonfuls of soft batter were dropped directly into the bubbling stock, where they puffed into pillowy dumplings that soaked up every ounce of flavor. This faster method made the dish accessible to busy mothers balancing long workdays and community meetings while still wanting to serve something hearty and nourishing. Each bowl carried the scent of thyme and black pepper, filling homes with warmth that went beyond simple calories. It was the taste of Sunday afternoons, of neighbors stopping by with cornbread, of quiet strength in the face of daily challenges. Over the decades, packaged soups and rotisserie chickens replaced the slow ritual, and the drop dumpling style slowly vanished, leaving behind only the memory of shared tables and the gentle comfort of broth and dough mingling together in perfect harmony. Fried green tomatoes with grits was a cheap Southern classic that carried both tradition and thrift in every bite. Unripe tomatoes, plucked before they spoiled, were sliced, dredged in cornmeal, and fried until golden in a skillet of hot oil or bacon fat. My grandmother paired them with bowls of creamy grits, the cornmeal base that stretched across countless households for pennies. The tomatoes were tangy and crisp, the grits soft and warm, creating a contrast that satisfied both hunger and taste. It was food that came straight from the garden and pantry, without needing costly additions. Families ate it often in the summer when tomatoes grew in abundance, but it found its way to the table year-round. The combination of fried green tomatoes with grits represented resilience, resourcefulness, and the comfort of tradition. In the 1960s, this meal stood as proof that good food did not depend on wealth but on knowing how to use what you had wisely. Cornbread and buttermilk was the quiet comfort that ended many long days. Grandparents crumbled leftover cornbread into big bowls, then poured cool buttermilk over the top until it softened. The tang met the sweetness of the corn, creating a flavor that felt like home. It was eaten slow, with a spoon, sometimes in silence, sometimes between stories. No stove was needed, no fancy ingredients, just what the house already had. It was breakfast, supper, or a midnight snack, dependable and kind. The meal cooled the body in summer and soothed the soul in winter. It reminded families that simplicity had its own kind of richness. Grandparents said it tasted best after a hard day's work, when hunger met gratitude. Cornbread and buttermilk was proof that the simplest things often held the most heart. The sound of the spoon scraping the bowl was steady, familiar, and peaceful. It was the kind of food you didn't rush, the kind that let the day fall away while you ate. Children grew up watching their elders eat it, learning that comfort didn't need sugar or spice, just love and something made by hand. Hogshead hash was a breakfast that spoke to the no-waste mentality of African American cooking traditions that valued resourcefulness and respect for food. When a hog was butchered, nothing was left unused, and the head provided meat that could be stewed, chopped, seasoned, and fried into hearty dishes. Families would mix the shredded meat with potatoes, onions, and sometimes peppers, then cook it together in a skillet until browned, crispy, and richly flavored. The flavor was intense, smoky, and savory, and it filled the house with a smell that lingered long after breakfast was finished. It was not just food, but a reminder of how creativity and resourcefulness made survival possible in communities where every scrap mattered. Children grew up eating it without complaint because it was hearty, flavorful, and kept them full through school, farm work, or chores. Adults relied on it as a way to honor the animal by using every part of it, ensuring nothing went to waste. Though hogshead hash has nearly vanished from today's kitchens, it once stood as a powerful symbol of resilience, thrift, and respect for tradition that sustained families. Stewed raccoon with sweet onions carried the flavor of wild woods and rural resourcefulness, a dish that turned a successful hunt into a gathering for neighbors and friends. Hunters skinned and cleaned the raccoon carefully, then simmered the meat low and slow with sliced sweet onions, bay leaves, and black pepper until it grew tender enough to fall from the bone. The rich aroma drifted across open fields and backyards, calling children and elders alike to the outdoor cookout. Long tables held iron pots bubbling over wood fires, with baskets of cornbread and jars of homemade pickles passed around to round out the meal. It was more than food. It was proof of skill, patience, and the ability to make the most of whatever nature offered. When supermarkets and packaged meats took over and rural hunting traditions faded, this once celebrated stew nearly vanished. What remains is the memory of smoky evenings and shared plates, where a humble raccoon fed a crowd and reminded everyone that community can rise from the simplest, wildest ingredients when cooked with care and shared with love beneath an open sky. Vegetable pot pie with biscuit crust was one of the cleverest ways to turn leftovers into a comforting meal. My grandmother gathered whatever vegetables were left from the week, beans, carrots, peas, or turnips, and simmered them in a simple gravy. She poured the mixture into a dish and covered it with biscuit dough instead of pie crust, which baked into a golden, fluffy topping. The result was hearty, filling, and deeply satisfying, stretching scraps into something that felt like a Sunday supper. Each slice carried both thrift and comfort, a reminder that nothing from the kitchen was wasted. The biscuit crust gave the dish substance, making it a true dinner instead of just a side. In the 1960s, vegetable pot pie with biscuit crust was common across homes that relied on ingenuity, turning odds and ends into meals that filled plates and warmed hearts. It was survival, wrapped in comfort, food that told the story of resourceful families making the most of what they had. Canned tuna casserole brought the 1970s pantry to life. A single can of tuna, a can of cream soup, a handful of noodles, and a little imagination turned into something hearty and warm. Grandparents stirred it all together, added a sprinkle of breadcrumbs on top, and baked it until it bubbled golden. The smell of the oven filled the house with comfort and memory. It was a one-pan miracle that fed everyone without complaint. Kids loved the creamy texture. Adults loved that it stretched the grocery dollar. Tuna casserole was proof that convenience could still taste like care, that even in hard times a meal could feel special. Every bite carried the warmth of family and the cleverness of making do. It was the kind of dish that filled the kitchen with chatter, laughter, and the clinking of spoons. The top crust gave a little crunch, while the inside stayed silky and rich. It felt like a feast, even when made from cans and boxes. Some families added peas or onions for color. Others topped it with crushed crackers instead of breadcrumbs. However it was made, it never failed to satisfy. It reminded everyone that even small things, when cooked with heart, could feel like abundance. Ash cake bread was born out of fire and hunger, a recipe that came alive in the heart of hard times. Cornmeal, salt, and water were all it needed. The dough was pressed together by hand and buried right into the hot ashes of a wood fireplace. It baked slowly, the outside hardening into a smoky crust, while the inside stayed soft, golden, and warm. When it came out, people brushed away the ashes, broke it open, and drizzled it with syrup or molasses. It had a taste that was both sweet and earthy, like the memory of home on a Sunday morning. Ash cake bread was a working person's meal, something you could make after a long day without needing an oven or a fancy pan. It was food that did not waste or wait, made for those who had nothing extra but still found comfort in what little they had. The smell of it filled small cabins and quiet kitchens, the sound of the crackling fire mixing with laughter or prayer. Every crumb reminded people that strength could grow even from ashes. Chess pie with cornmeal crust stood as a thrifty yet indulgent dessert that thrived in kitchens where nothing was wasted. A rustic crust of cornmeal and flour held a filling of eggs, sugar, butter, and a splash of vinegar, creating a custard that baked into a golden, slightly tangy sweetness. The cornmeal added a gentle crunch that contrasted beautifully with the silky interior, turning basic pantry staples into something worthy of a Sunday celebration. Families served it at church suppers, holiday dinners, and community fundraisers, where one pie could be sliced thinly to serve many guests. Its straightforward ingredients made it affordable during lean times, while its rich taste made it feel like a luxury. As store-bought pies and instant puddings became common, the old-fashioned cornmeal version slowly disappeared. Today, it lingers mainly in heirloom cookbooks and quiet memories, a testament to the creativity and resilience of home bakers who transformed simple staples into desserts that brought joy and togetherness during an era of profound change. Stuffed bell peppers with rice and onion were a dish that stretched garden vegetables into something filling and satisfying. Bell peppers were inexpensive when in season, and my grandmother made the most of them by stuffing each with seasoned rice, onions, and sometimes a bit of tomato. Meat was optional and often absent, but the rice itself carried enough substance to make the meal complete. The peppers were baked until tender, their skins blistering slightly while the rice absorbed every bit of flavor. Each stuffed pepper became its own little meal, portioned perfectly for children and adults alike. The aroma of roasted peppers and onions filled the house, signaling comfort even when budgets were stretched thin. It was a dish that looked impressive despite being made from humble ingredients, and it reminded families that presentation mattered too. Stuffed bell peppers with rice and onion carried both thrift and pride, proving that even in hard times, dinner could be hearty, healthy, and beautiful on the table. Okra and tomatoes were the colors of the garden cooked into a pot. Grandparents sliced fresh okra, juicy and green, and stirred it with tomatoes and onions in bacon grease. The smell was sharp and earthy, filling the house with the scent of summer. The okra thickened the stew, the tomatoes gave it brightness, and a sprinkle of pepper tied it all together. Sometimes it was served over rice, sometimes eaten with cornbread, but always with pride. It was a dish that celebrated what the land could give, even when money could not. Every bite carried sunlight, soil, and sweat. The taste of labor turned into comfort. It was simple, yes, but it spoke of tradition, of survival, and of joy found in small harvests. The colors in the pot looked like a painting, red and green, bright and alive. The first spoonful always carried the warmth of the garden, a reminder that nourishment didn't come from the store but from the earth and the hands that worked it. Grandparents said this was food that told the truth about life: hard work, patience, and reward. Sorrel leaf stew was the taste of home for generations who carried their roots wherever life took them. The wild green leaves, bright and tangy, grew freely along fences and fields, waiting for careful hands to gather them. Washed and simmered with onions, garlic, and a little oil, they softened into a dark green broth that shimmered in the pot. Sometimes salted pork or dried fish bones were added for depth, but even without them, the stew stood proud. Its flavor was sharp and earthy, sour and comforting all at once. For families from the coastal South and Caribbean, this dish was not just food. It was a memory of sunlight, laughter, and work well done. It was a taste of mothers stirring pots over open fires, of children running barefoot through red dirt yards. Sorrel leaf stew reminded everyone that strength grew from soil and struggle, that flavor could come from the simplest gift of the land. When a spoon dipped into that steaming bowl, it carried the sound of old prayers and soft voices calling people to eat. In every swallow lived the rhythm of survival, steady and sure, like the ocean tides that shaped those who first made it. Cathead biscuits earned their name from their impressive size, each one as big as a cat's head and twice as fluffy. Bakers mixed simple ingredients of flour, baking powder, lard, and buttermilk into a soft dough, then dropped heaping spoonfuls onto hot pans without bothering to roll or cut. In a hot oven, they rose high and golden, forming tender layers that peeled apart with steam and the smell of warm butter. Families served them at dawn before work or after late-night meetings, splitting them open for gravy or honey when time was short and appetites were large. The biscuits traveled to marches wrapped in cloth, still warm hours later, providing strength for long days. Over time, refrigerated dough and fast food breakfasts pushed them aside, and the art of drop biscuits nearly disappeared from everyday life. Yet their hearty comfort remains a symbol of hospitality and resilience, proof that the simplest ingredients can feed both hunger and hope. Cornmeal dumplings in tomato broth were the type of dish that felt simple but filling, carrying both thrift and comfort in every bowl. The broth began with canned or fresh tomatoes, cooked down with onions, garlic, and a touch of seasoning to build a savory base. My grandmother mixed cornmeal with a bit of flour, salt, and water to form small dumplings, dropping them carefully into the bubbling pot. As they simmered, the dumplings softened into tender bites, soaking up the tang of the tomatoes while thickening the stew. The smell alone brought everyone to the kitchen, the blend of corn and tomato promising something hearty without needing meat. Cornmeal was cheap and always on hand, a staple in Black households across the South. Tomato broth was inexpensive too, whether from garden harvests or canned goods bought in bulk. Together, they created a meal that cost next to nothing but filled hungry stomachs with warmth. Cornmeal dumplings in tomato broth turned two of the humblest ingredients into a family staple, proving that frugality and care could produce meals worth remembering. Pig feet with hot sauce turned thrift into celebration. The feet simmered for hours in a big pot with onions, vinegar, and pepper, until the meat turned tender enough to slip from the bone. The air grew thick with spice and memory, the kind of smell that called everyone to the kitchen. Grandparents served them steaming, with hot sauce on the side and cornbread ready to catch the juices. The flavor was bold, rich, and full of soul, a taste that made you pause and savor. It was food for gatherings, for laughter, for long nights spent together. Every bite was messy, sticky, and worth the wait. Pig feet taught patience and appreciation, reminding everyone that nothing in the kitchen should ever be wasted. In every pot boiled the lesson that hard work and good seasoning could turn even the humblest cut into something to be proud of. It was a dish that didn't hide its roots. It celebrated them. Families would sit shoulder to shoulder, wiping their hands between bites, laughing at stories told for the 100th time. The sound of bones clinking against plates was its own kind of music. The hot sauce gave each bite a spark, a fire that matched the spirit of the people who made it. Pot scrappin' soup was the kind of meal that made use of every last bit that life gave. When the pantry was empty, people turned to what clung to the bottom of the pot. They poured in hot water, scraped up every browned edge and leftover piece of vegetable or meat, and built a new meal from what was left behind. It simmered for hours until the flavors came together, smoky and deep, with hints of salt and spice from earlier meals. No two pots ever tasted the same, and that was the beauty of it. Sometimes it had bits of onion, sometimes beans or bones, always something saved from before. It filled the air with a smell of gratitude, the kind that made even the poorest home feel rich. Children dunked stale cornbread in it, soaking up every drop. Pot scrappin' soup reminded families that nothing was ever truly gone, not flavor, not hope, not care. It turned waste into warmth and leftovers into love. The sound of that bubbling pot was a hymn for survival, proof that the end of the week still had something worth waiting for. Hoe cakes with cane syrup butter carried the flavor of history in every sizzling bite, linking enslaved African cooking techniques to the civil rights kitchens of the 20th century. Cornmeal was stirred with a splash of water or buttermilk to form a simple batter, then fried on a hot griddle or even the flat side of a farming hoe, which gave the dish its memorable name. When served hot, each thin cake was brushed with butter blended with dark cane syrup, creating a sweet glaze that soaked into the crisp edges. These cakes fed field workers at dawn, families after late meetings, and crowds gathered for marches, offering warmth and quick nourishment without expensive ingredients. The combination of smoky corn and caramel sweetness spoke of resourcefulness and survival. As breakfast menus shifted to boxed cereals and frozen waffles, hoe cakes gradually slipped from daily life. Yet their story remains a testament to perseverance and the deep roots of African American foodways that sustained both body and spirit during years of struggle and triumph. Giblet gravy over rice was one of those dinners that showed how nothing went to waste in the kitchen. Chicken was expensive, but the innards, the gizzard, liver, and heart, were cheap or sometimes even given away by butchers. My grandmother chopped them small, simmered them in broth, and thickened the pot into a rich gravy that smelled like Sunday supper. Poured over rice, it became hearty enough to stretch across the whole family. The rice soaked up the flavor, turning a small handful of giblets into a meal that fed 6 mouths without complaint. Some children turned up their noses at first, but hunger taught quick appreciation, and the taste of the gravy was strong, savory, and full of life. She said, "Giblet gravy was proof that dignity came not from the cut of meat, but from the hands that prepared it." In the 1960s, this dish carried people through lean nights, filling bowls with warmth when little else could be afforded. Giblet gravy over rice was frugality turned into something satisfying. Lima beans and rice were the heartbeat of humble suppers. The dry beans soaked overnight in cool water, swelling with promise. The next morning, they simmered with onions, salt, and sometimes a scrap of ham or a spoon of lard for flavor. The smell drifted through small kitchens, soft and soothing, like the memory of peace. When the beans turned creamy, rice joined the plate, a mound of comfort waiting to catch every drop of the broth. It was food that filled you without fuss, a steady meal that kept the body strong and the soul calm. Grandparents stirred it slow, never wasting a grain or bean. The dish stretched across days, reheated, shared, and remembered. Each bite was a reminder that survival could taste good, that frugality did not mean lack. Lima beans and rice were the taste of balance, simple, complete, and deeply human. When money was thin and work was long, this was the dinner that never failed, a pot of patience feeding everyone who came hungry. Fried catfish and cornbread was a breakfast plate that reflected the abundance of rivers and the skill of African American cooks in the South. Catfish could be caught at little cost, cleaned, coated in cornmeal, and fried crisp in cast iron skillets. Paired with hot cornbread fresh from the oven, the meal was both hearty and nourishing. It gave workers the energy needed for long days in the fields, and children the strength to get through school without hunger. Families often made it on weekends when fishing provided enough to share with neighbors, turning it into a communal meal. The taste was bold and rustic, with a combination of crunchy fish and soft bread that defined comfort. Though fish is not often associated with breakfast today, fried catfish and cornbread once stood proudly on morning tables. It remains a reflection of resilience and resourcefulness, showing how nature and tradition came together to sustain communities. Pecan praline candy was a sweet fundraiser favorite, its brown sugar scent drifting across town squares and church parking lots during marches and community events. Fresh shelled pecans were coated in a bubbling mixture of sugar, cream, and butter, then cooled into glossy clusters that snapped with each bite. The rich caramel flavor and buttery crunch made them irresistible, while their portability made them perfect for sharing at rallies or selling to raise money for transportation and printing leaflets. Volunteers stirred the mixture over open flames or simple stovetops, working quickly before the candy hardened, a process that required both patience and skill. Children would watch wide-eyed as the shiny pralines set on wax paper, eager for the first taste. Though still beloved in some southern sweet shops, homemade pralines like these rarely appear on family tables today. They remain a delicious reminder of the grassroots efforts that fueled a movement, proving that even a simple candy could help sustain both morale and purpose in challenging times. Stewed field peas with cornbread was a southern staple that seemed to appear on tables no matter how hard times got. Field peas were inexpensive, easy to grow, and dried well enough to last through seasons, making them a dependable ingredient when other food was scarce. My grandmother simmered them slowly with onion, maybe a scrap of pork if any was left, until the peas broke down into a thick, savory stew. Cornbread was baked alongside, crumbly and warm, and served as the perfect companion, soaking up every bit of broth. Together they made a full meal, packed with enough substance to keep workers fed after long days in the fields or factories. Field peas were humble compared to black-eyed peas or butter beans, but they carried a taste of the land, earthy and comforting. For families with little money to spare, this pairing was dependable, stretching across generations as a dish of both necessity and pride. Stewed field peas with cornbread filled stomachs, warmed hearts, and reminded everyone that simple food could still be good food. Baked macaroni and cheese was the crown jewel of Sunday dinner. Grandparents mixed cooked noodles with milk, cheese, and eggs, baking it until the top turned golden brown and crispy. The edges were everyone's favorite, chewy and rich, the middle creamy and soft. The smell drifted through the house like a celebration. It was a dish that took time, one made for gathering and sharing. Even when the cheese was rationed or stretched, it always tasted like abundance. It was food for holidays, homecomings, and hope. Each forkful carried history and heart, a promise that love could be baked and served in a single pan. When the bubbling cheese hit the air, it was like joy announcing itself. Families waited eagerly for the first slice, everyone reaching for the crispy corners. Grandparents might add a touch of paprika on top or mix in bits of leftover meat to make it stretch further. It was a meal that brought people together, a warm, bubbling symbol of comfort and care. No matter the circumstance, baked macaroni and cheese made every table feel like home. Corncob jelly was one of those miracles that made people smile at their own cleverness. When the corn was shucked and the cobs left behind, no one dared to throw them out. Those bare cobs went into a big pot of water, boiled until the water turned golden and sweet-smelling. Sugar and a little lemon juice got added next, then everything was strained until the liquid gleamed like honey. The result was a jelly that tasted faintly of corn, syrupy and light, the perfect spread for biscuits or toast. People used it when fruit was scarce, and it carried a quiet pride that came from turning scraps into sweetness. Grandparents remembered it from their childhood, when waste was not an option and imagination ruled the kitchen. Corncob jelly was proof that flavor could be coaxed out of what others might ignore. It was soft, shining, and made with patience. Those who tasted it never forgot that feeling of abundance born from scarcity. Each spoonful told the story of hands that worked hard, saved everything, and still found time to make something beautiful. Okra and field. Pea jambalaya was a celebration of southern gardens and shared tables, stretching modest ingredients into a dish big enough to feed a crowd. Fresh okra and tender field peas were sautéed with onions, garlic, and bell peppers before being simmered with rice and a pinch of smoked meat or sausage for depth. The result was a pot of rich, earthy flavor that captured the essence of late summer harvests and the African culinary traditions that shaped the Gulf Coast. Neighbors prepared it for community meetings, bringing baskets of homegrown vegetables and gathering around wide kettles that steamed with the scent of thyme and spice. It was filling, nutritious, and endlessly adaptable depending on what the garden offered. As industrial farming and supermarket produce took over, the local field pea varieties became harder to find, and the dish slowly faded from weeknight menus. Its memory lives on as a flavorful tribute to cooperation, thrift, and the sustaining power of shared harvests. Fish head stew was a dish born out of necessity, yet it carried surprising depth and flavor. Fish heads, often discarded by others, were simmered slowly with onions, potatoes, and rice until they yielded every ounce of richness to the broth. My grandmother insisted the heads made the stew better than fillies, providing body and nourishment that nothing else could. The bones and skin flavored the liquid until it turned hearty and comforting. Potatoes stretched the meal, rice thickened it, and vegetables added substance, turning scraps into a filling supper. The taste was strong, earthy, and unforgettable, reminding everyone that no part of food should go unused. For Black families in the 1960s, fish head stew was a common way to stretch the catch of the day, ensuring nothing went to waste. It became a lesson in thrift and gratitude, proof that survival demanded creativity. Fish head stew was both humble and mighty, sustaining families through lean times with flavor and tradition. Salmon croquettes were the feast that came from a can. Grandparents mixed canned salmon with chopped onions, a little cornmeal, and an egg to hold it together. The mixture sizzled in the pan, forming golden patties that smelled like celebration. Outside, they were crisp and brown, inside, soft and savory. Served with grits or bread, they turned an ordinary night into something special. Kids called them fish cakes and ate them fast, the crunch echoing across the table. Sometimes a bit of hot sauce went on top for heat, sometimes ketchup for sweetness. No matter how they were served, they were always gone before they cooled. Salmon croquettes proved that flavor came from creativity, not cost. They were rich with pride and memory, the taste of survival wrapped in golden crust. Pumpkin stew with onions was the kind of dish that proved homegrown vegetables could anchor a meal. Pumpkins were easy to plant, easy to store, and yielded enough flesh to keep a family fed for weeks. My grandmother peeled chunks of pumpkin, cooked them down with onions, and let the pot simmer until it turned thick and savory. The sweetness of the pumpkin mixed with the sharpness of onion, creating a balance that felt hearty and satisfying. Sometimes she added a little pepper or a leftover bone for extra flavor, but even plain, the stew was filling. Served with bread or cornbread, it was enough to feed a household without meat or costly ingredients. In the 1960s, pumpkins were not just for pies or holidays. They were staples, pulled from backyard gardens and turned into supper. The stew carried warmth, thrift, and creativity in every spoonful. Pumpkin stew with onions showed that survival did not mean going without taste, only learning to love what the land gave freely. Molasses-baked apples filled kitchens with a fragrance so rich it could draw neighbors to the door. Firm apples were cored and stuffed with butter and a generous drizzle of dark molasses, then baked until their skins wrinkled and their flesh turned soft and caramel sweet. The syrup pooled at the bottom of the pan, creating a rich sauce that begged for a spoon of cream if any was on hand. This simple dessert required no special equipment and made the most of pantry staples, making it ideal for weeknights when time and money were scarce. Children loved watching the fruit collapse into warm sweetness, while adults appreciated the depth of flavor that only slow-baked molasses could bring. Shared after church or enjoyed beside late-night conversations, these apples represented the comfort of the familiar and the creativity of cooks who refused to waste a single ingredient. Over time, boxed cakes and instant puddings replaced the humble baked apple. But the memory of that dark, sugary aroma remains powerful. Fried rice with scrambled egg was the kind of supper that could be made out of almost nothing but still managed to feel hearty. Leftover rice was saved from the night before, reheated in a skillet with a little oil or lard, and then combined with scrambled egg to add richness. My grandmother would sometimes add chopped onion or green pepper if the garden allowed, but the dish stood strong even without extras. The rice fried up golden, the egg binding it together into something more than scraps. A dash of salt and pepper finished it, though hot sauce often appeared at the table too. What amazed me was how it transformed simple grains into a filling plate that stretched across a family without breaking the budget. The meal carried warmth and thrift in equal measure, reminding everyone that dinner did not need meat to be satisfying. In the 1960s, fried rice with scrambled egg was not fancy, but it was dependable, the kind of dish that fed children and adults alike with just enough to keep spirits steady. Fried mackerel fillets brought the sea to the table without breaking the bank. Grandparents bought them salted, sometimes canned, sometimes fresh if the market was kind. Each fillet was rinsed, dried, then dredged in cornmeal seasoned with pepper and a touch of cayenne. When they hit the hot grease, the kitchen came alive with crackles and curls of steam. The fish fried golden brown, the smell sharp and inviting. Served with grits, collard greens, or a slice of cornbread, it was a full meal made from little. The first bite carried crunch, then warmth, then salt that lingered like the memory of the coast. Children learned to eat carefully, picking around the small bones with patience. For many, fried mackerel was the taste of survival and skill, of knowing how to turn thrift into comfort. It was eaten with laughter, with stories of better days and pride in how far they had come. Every piece told the truth that even a poor man's fish could taste like celebration when cooked with love. Collard green omelet was a breakfast born from thrift and the habit of making yesterday's leftovers stretch. Collard greens, usually cooked long and slow with seasoning, were often tucked into eggs the next morning, creating a dish that was both frugal and flavorful. Families valued it because it made use of what they already had, ensuring nothing went to waste. The combination of tender greens with fluffy eggs gave a balance of nutrition and satisfaction. For children, it was a familiar flavor carried into a new form, while adults enjoyed the heartiness without requiring more expensive meat. It was a dish that tied breakfast to dinner, blending the rhythms of the household kitchen into one continuous cycle of reuse. Betty Crocker kitchens may have praised convenience, but African-American homes thrived on this kind of ingenuity. Collard green omelets are rare today, but they once carried the quiet wisdom of making much from little and starting mornings strong. Barley and collard soup turned humble garden greens and hearty grain into a pot of deep comfort that could feed a crowded table. Collard leaves were washed and sliced thin, then simmered with chopped onions, garlic, and handfuls of pearled barley until the broth thickened and the flavors mingled. A dash of black pepper and a splash of cider vinegar added brightness, while a leftover ham bone or smoked turkey wing gave the soup a gentle smokiness when available. Families valued the dish for its ability to stretch a small harvest into many servings, an essential trait during hard times and long organizing nights. Community centers ladled it out during winter meetings, warming both body and spirit. Over the years, quicker meals and boxed soups replaced slow-simmered kettles, and this thrifty recipe quietly slipped from daily rotation. Yet its memory still speaks of gardens tended with care and a belief that nourishment should be shared generously and without hurry. Boiled turnips with cornbread crumbs was another way families stretched cheap vegetables into full meals. Turnips were easy to grow and often given away, their strong flavor softened by boiling them until tender. My grandmother ladled the hot turnips into bowls and topped them with crumbled cornbread, the bread soaking up the broth until it became hearty enough for supper. It was plain food, yes, but it kept stomachs full on nights when meat was scarce. The bitterness of the turnips mellowed with time and seasoning, and the cornbread gave every bite body and comfort. Children might have grumbled, but they ate their fill because there was no room for waste. In the 1960s, this dish was common across kitchens that relied on ingenuity to make ends meet. It was a simple combination, yet it carried dignity because it represented survival. Boiled turnips with cornbread crumbs may not have been fancy, but it held families together through lean times. Fried catfish. Fridays were the highlight of the week, a reward after days of work. The fish was cleaned, seasoned, and dredged in cornmeal before meeting the hot grease. The crackle of the oil was music in the kitchen, a sound everyone knew meant dinner was near. The smell drifted outside, pulling in neighbors and cousins alike. Plates were filled with fried catfish, hush puppies, and maybe some coleslaw if there was time. Grandparents said grace, then everyone dug in, hands and laughter flying. It was food for the spirit, food for community, food for faith. Fried catfish Fridays were not about wealth. They were about togetherness, joy, and pride in what could be made from so little. The meal was a celebration of ending the week strong, a tradition that turned simple fish into a feast. The crispy edges crunched, the inside melted soft, and the taste carried generations of memory. For many, this dinner meant the start of the weekend, a time to gather, to rest, and to give thanks for making it through another week. It was Southern joy served hot from the skillet. Red gravy with rice was a breakfast dish that combined economy with comfort in African American households. The gravy was made from tomatoes, onions, and seasoning, simmered until thick and poured over steaming rice. It was filling, affordable, and deeply satisfying, providing warmth and energy to carry through the day. For many families, rice was cheaper than bread and could be stretched to feed everyone, while tomatoes added both flavor and color. The dish was common across the South, where it became a daily staple for working people who needed hearty food before long hours of labor. Children often grew up with it as a familiar morning ritual, while adults valued its reliability and ease of preparation. Red gravy with rice was never fancy, but it symbolized resilience and the ability to make simple ingredients carry meaning. Though rarely served in breakfast form today, it was once a proud and practical tradition. Sorrel cooler brought a tart crimson sparkle to long, hot days when people marched, rallied, and gathered under the southern sun. Dried hibiscus petals steeped in boiling water released a brilliant ruby color and a sharp berry flavor, while slices of fresh ginger added a gentle warmth that lingered on the tongue. Sweetened lightly with cane sugar and served over clinking ice, the drink refreshed tired bodies and lifted spirits. Caribbean immigrants had long carried sorrel traditions into Southern kitchens, and during the Civil Rights Movement, the cooler became a quiet staple at community picnics and protest rest stops. Volunteers poured it into mason jars and paper cups, handing it to weary marchers whose voices were hoarse from chanting. Its tangy kick was a reminder of shared heritage and strength drawn from many cultures. Over time, commercial soft drinks crowded out the hibiscus cooler, but its memory remains a symbol of unity and resilience, a drink that quenched more than thirst and colored every gathering with courage. Mustard greens with salt pork were the kind of dish that spoke to both thrift and tradition. Collard greens were loved, but when money was tight, mustard greens filled the pot just as well, with a sharper bite and a quicker cook. My grandmother simmered them slowly with scraps of salt pork, the fat melting into the broth until every leaf carried flavor. The kitchen smelled earthy, smoky, and strong, reminding everyone that even the humblest greens could feel like a feast when seasoned with care. She always said the broth, what some called potlikker, was the best part, soaking it up with cornbread to make sure not a drop was wasted. It was a dish that brought families together around the table, passing bowls and breaking bread even when meat was scarce. Salt pork was cheap because it was mostly fat, but it gave depth to every bite, transforming greens into comfort. In the 1960s, this was not just a side, it was supper, filling bellies after long days of work. Mustard greens with salt pork carried heritage, thrift, and resilience in one simmering pot. Chitterlings, or chitlins, were not for the faint-hearted but for those who knew the meaning of respect. Grandparents cleaned them for hours, boiling them slow to soften the tough cuts. The smell was strong, but so was the pride that came with cooking them right. They seasoned them heavy with vinegar, pepper, and patience. Served hot with cornbread or rice, they were a delicacy born from struggle and tradition. Every bite told a story of survival, of making use of what others threw away and turning it into something sacred. It was a dish tied to heritage, to memory, to the rhythm of the South. Chitlins were not just food. They were legacy on a plate. They took courage to cook and love to appreciate. Families gathered around pots that steamed like offerings, the kitchen alive with heat and history. It was the kind of meal that demanded work but gave back in pride. For many, chitlins were a reminder of ancestors who had done much with little, who found dignity in the act of feeding their own. Eating them was not just tradition, it was a way of honoring everything that came before. Pork cracklin cornbread was a dish that made even a simple pan of bread feel like a celebration. Cracklins, small, crispy bits left from rendering pork fat, were cheap to come by and packed with flavor. My grandmother folded them into cornbread batter, the fat melting and the crunchy pieces scattering through every slice. Baked until golden, it came out hearty and rich, with texture that plain cornbread never had. The salty pork balanced the sweet cornmeal, making each bite feel indulgent even though the ingredients were inexpensive. Families sliced it thick and ate it alone or alongside beans, greens, or stews, letting the cracklins carry the flavor of meat through the whole meal. In the 1960s, this kind of dish made families feel proud, as though they had something special on the table despite the hardships around them. Pork cracklin cornbread was thrift turned into joy, simple food lifted by the spirit of making do. Peanut brittle popcorn ball satisfied sweet cravings while offering the perfect portability for marches, picnics, and evening meetings. Freshly popped corn was tossed in a bubbling syrup of sugar, butter, and roasted peanuts, then shaped quickly into warm, sticky spheres before the mixture cooled and hardened. Each bite combined the nutty crunch of brittle with the airy lightness of popcorn, creating a candy that was both filling and easy to carry. Mothers and church volunteers wrapped the glossy treats in wax paper and stacked them in baskets for children to grab on their way to rallies or long car rides. They required only a few pantry ingredients and a watchful eye over the stove, making them affordable for large families and community fundraisers. As commercial candy bars and packaged snacks gained ground, these homemade popcorn balls became less common. Still, the memory of their caramel fragrance and satisfying crackle lingers as a reminder of shared kitchens, careful hands, and the small joys that fueled big movements. Barbecue pig ears were a dish that showed how deeply rooted thrift and tradition were in Black cooking. Pig ears were among the cheapest cuts, often discarded or sold for pennies at butcher shops. My grandmother cleaned them carefully, simmered them until tender, and then finished them with homemade barbecue sauce that clung to every bite. The texture was chewy but flavorful, and paired with cornbread or greens, it became a meal that carried both satisfaction and culture. Families gathered around plates of pig ears during weekends or special occasions, treating them as a delicacy despite their humble beginnings. The sauce was smoky, tangy, and rich, masking the simplicity of the cut with layers of flavor. Eating barbecue pig ears was about more than just nourishment. It was about making something from nothing, about honoring traditions that valued every part of the animal. In the 1960s, dishes like this kept families connected to heritage and survival alike. Barbecue pig ears turned scraps into a meal that was cheap but never forgotten. Smothered chicken backs were proof that nothing went to waste in a smart kitchen. The backs were the cheapest part of the bird, bony and overlooked, but in careful hands they became tender miracles. Grandparents fried them first in a cast-iron pan, browning the skin to perfection. The drippings turned into gravy, flour, water, and a slow stir until thick and golden. The chicken went back in, simmering until the meat slipped off the bone and the gravy clung to every piece. The smell was deep and familiar, the kind that pulled everyone to the table. A pot of rice sat nearby, waiting to catch all that flavor. It was food born from thrift, yet full of pride. Every bite told the same story, of making do, of feeding many from a little, of turning scraps into something worthy of thanks. Cornmeal dumplings in tomato broth were the type of dish that felt simple but filling, carrying both thrift and comfort in every bowl. The broth began with canned or fresh tomatoes, cooked down with onions, garlic, and a touch of seasoning to build a savory base. My grandmother mixed cornmeal with a bit of flour, salt, and water to form small dumplings, dropping them carefully into the bubbling pot. As they simmered, the dumplings softened into tender bites, soaking up the tang of the tomatoes while thickening the stew. The smell alone brought everyone to the kitchen, the blend of corn and tomato promising something hearty without needing meat. Cornmeal was cheap and always on hand, a staple in Black households across the South. Tomato broth was inexpensive too, whether from garden harvests or canned goods bought in bulk. Together, they created a meal that cost next to nothing but filled hungry stomachs with warmth. Cornmeal dumplings in tomato broth turned two of the humblest ingredients into a family staple, proving that frugality and care could produce meals worth remembering. Fish roe and onions was a breakfast plate that reflected the close ties African American communities had with rivers and local fishing. Stewed muscadine grapes offered a deep purple sweetness that warmed cool evenings and delighted anyone lucky enough to taste it. The thick-skinned grapes, native to the American South, were simmered slowly with sugar and a touch of lemon until their juices turned syrupy and rich. The softened fruit released a fragrance of earth and sun that filled kitchens with the promise of comfort. Ladled over hot biscuits or crumbled cornbread, the compote brought a burst of flavor to simple suppers and late-night snacks. Families prized it as a way to use every bit of the harvest, turning backyard vines into something that could brighten winter mornings. During the Civil Rights era, jars of stewed grapes traveled to gatherings where neighbors shared food and stories well past sunset. Over time, mass-market jams and jellies replaced the tradition, and the muscadine itself became harder to find. Yet the memory of that dark syrup remains, a taste of both abundance and careful preservation. Shepherd's pie with mashed sweet potatoes was a clever twist on an old classic that fit the budget of Black families in the 1960s. Instead of pricey white potatoes, sweet potatoes from the garden were boiled, mashed, and spread on top of a filling made from scraps of meat and vegetables. My grandmother would use whatever was left, bits of beef, chicken, or even pork, chopped small and cooked with onions, carrots, or peas until it formed a savory base. The sweet potato topping baked into a golden layer that balanced the salty meat with a touch of natural sweetness. It was hearty enough to fill everyone, but cheap enough to make even during lean weeks. Sweet potatoes were plentiful in many southern gardens, and they stretched farther than most vegetables because they were filling and rich in flavor. Shepherd's pie with mashed sweet potatoes was more than just food. It was a statement of ingenuity. Families made do with what they had and still put something warm and comforting on the table. That golden crust represented thrift and care, carrying both survival and love in every spoonful. Neckbone stew was the dish that made patience taste like home. Grandparents started it early, browning the bones slow until the house filled with the smell of salt, pepper, and smoke. The meat was tough at first, but they knew that time could turn even the hardest cuts tender. A pot of onions, celery, and carrots followed, simmering until the broth grew deep and rich. The bones gave flavor to everything they touched, the fat melting into gold that coated every spoonful. Sometimes potatoes joined the mix, sometimes rice, but the heart of the dish was always the same, making something out of what others overlooked. The stew bubbled for hours, humming low like a hymn on the stove. By supper, the meat slipped free from the bone, soft and ready. It fed everyone, from children to elders, warming stomachs and spirits alike. Neckbone stew was not just food, it was proof that care could turn scarcity into comfort. Every bite held a memory of waiting, stirring, tasting, and sharing. It taught that good things come slow and that nothing was ever too little when cooked with love. In every bowl lived the story of endurance, flavor, and faith that kept families strong through every hard season. Hominy crackle porridge was the kind of breakfast that came from patience, not plenty. When there was no bacon, no biscuits, and not much else in the pantry, leftover hominy saved the day. It was stirred into a pot with water or milk, sweetened with molasses, and spiced with nutmeg or cinnamon if you had it. The sound of the spoon scraping against the pot made a rhythm that felt almost like music, slow and steady like morning itself. When the porridge bubbled, it released a scent both earthy and rich, a blend of smoke, sugar, and warmth. Children would sit waiting with chipped bowls in their hands, ready for the first ladle. It was thick and creamy, sometimes with a thin golden crust if it sat long enough. Hominy crackle porridge filled bellies and lifted moods, turning scraps into something special. It reminded families that sweetness did not depend on sugar alone, but on love and endurance. Every spoonful was a story of thrift and tenderness, made from what was left and shared without complaint. When the bowl was empty, people still felt full, not just from the food, but from the comfort it brought to a hard world made softer by care. Baked eggplant with cornbread crust turned a basket of garden vegetables into a farmhouse casserole fit for Sunday gatherings. Thick slices of eggplant were salted to draw out their bitterness, then layered with onions, tomatoes, and a light scattering of cheese if available. A batter of cornmeal, milk, and eggs was poured over the top, forming a golden crust that baked to a gentle crunch while the vegetables softened beneath. The aroma of roasting corn and sweet eggplant filled the house, promising a dish that felt both hearty and wholesome. Families brought it to church socials and community suppers, where it could be served warm or at room temperature without losing its charm. It was a clever way to use plentiful summer produce and stretch a meal when meat was scarce or too costly. With the rise of frozen entrees and fast food, this casserole gradually disappeared. What lingers is the memory of bubbling ovens and a dish that celebrated both thrift and the full bounty of a backyard garden. Pork cracklin' cornbread was a dish that made even a simple pan of bread feel like a celebration. Cracklins, small crispy bits left from rendering pork fat, were cheap to come by and packed with flavor. My grandmother folded them into cornbread batter, the fat melting and the crunchy pieces scattering through every slice. Baked until golden, it came out hearty and rich, with texture that plain cornbread never had. The salty pork balanced the sweet cornmeal, making each bite feel indulgent even though the ingredients were inexpensive. Families sliced it thick and ate it alone or alongside beans, greens, or stews, letting the cracklins carry the flavor of meat through the whole meal. In the 1960s, this kind of dish made families feel proud, as though they had something special on the table despite the hardships around them. Pork cracklin' cornbread was thrift turned into joy, simple food lifted by the spirit of making do. Pinto bean soup was the meal that made hard times taste soft. Grandparents soaked the beans overnight, letting them swell in tin pots while they slept. The next morning, onions, salt, and sometimes a small ham bone went into the water. The kitchen filled with the slow rhythm of simmering, a sound of hope that things would stretch one more day. The broth thickened as it cooked, rich with starch and strength. The smell alone could calm an empty stomach. Sometimes they crushed cornbread into the bowl, letting it soak up every drop. It was food that filled and comforted, humble yet full of soul. Pinto bean soup did not need meat or luxury to matter. It only needed time and patience. Grandparents called it a working man's stew, but it was more than that. It was a reminder that no meal made with love was ever small. Okra fritters with corn silk were the kind of kitchen magic that only came from necessity and imagination. In the long summer months, when the fields were full and money was not, people used every part of what they harvested. The corn silk that clung to the ears was not thrown away, but saved and shredded, added into batter alongside chopped okra, flour, and a splash of milk or water. When dropped into hot oil, the fritters puffed and crackled, their edges turning golden and crisp. The smell was something you could follow from down the road. Warm, nutty, and sweet with that faint scent of corn. Each bite was crunchy on the outside and tender in the middle, with little strings of corn silk that gave it texture and charm. They were served with syrup or vinegar, depending on what the family had, eaten right out of the pan when patience ran out. Okra fritters with corn silk were food born from care and cleverness, proof that waste had no place in a humble kitchen. Every family had its own version, passed quietly between generations, carrying the taste of late afternoons, hard work, and simple joy. They were poverty's poetry, fried into something worth remembering. Okra rice cakes turned leftover grains and garden vegetables into a crisp and satisfying supper, stretching small harvests to feed many mouths. Cold rice from the previous day was mixed with chopped okra, diced onions, and beaten eggs, seasoned with salt and a pinch of cayenne for heat. Small patties were shaped by hand and pan seared in hot oil until the outsides turned golden and the centers held a pleasant chew. Each cake offered the earthy taste of okra balanced by the mild sweetness of rice, a pairing that felt hearty without needing meat. Families served them with sliced tomatoes or spoonfuls of relish, creating a meal that was both economical and nourishing after long days of work or community organizing. Children enjoyed the crispy edges, while adults appreciated how nothing went to waste. Over time, instant rice dishes and frozen dinners replaced the slow satisfaction of these cakes, leaving behind only the memory of sizzling skillets and the smell of toasted grains in a warm kitchen. Butter beans and rice were another cheap but comforting meal that carried families through lean times. Butter beans, with their creamy texture, were slow cooked until tender, often flavored with a smoked ham hock or bone if one was available. The smoky taste infused the beans and created a rich broth that poured beautifully over rice. My grandmother used long-grain rice that stretched a pot of beans into enough servings for the whole household. The dish was hearty, filling, and nourishing, feeding both body and spirit. Butter beans were inexpensive compared to meat, yet they carried enough protein to keep families going strong. Children learned to appreciate the soft beans and flavorful broth as part of everyday meals, and adults recognized their value in stretching budgets. It was not a dish of extravagance but of practicality, a dinner that turned cheap staples into something people looked forward to. Butter beans and rice told the story of resilience in kitchens where every penny counted and every plate needed to satisfy. Pinto bean soup was the meal that made hard times taste soft. Grandparents soaked the beans overnight, letting them swell in tin pots while they slept. The next morning, onions, salt, and sometimes a small ham bone went into the water. The kitchen filled with the slow rhythm of simmering, a sound of hope that things would stretch one more day. The broth thickened as it cooked, rich with starch and strength. The smell alone could calm an empty stomach. Sometimes they crushed cornbread into the bowl, letting it soak up every drop. It was food that filled and comforted, humble yet full of soul. Pinto bean soup did not need meat or luxury to matter. It only needed time and patience. Grandparents called it a working man's stew, but it was more than that. It was a reminder that no meal made with love was ever small. Hog maw and potatoes was a breakfast that carried both weight and flavor for households that needed energy for the day ahead. Hog maw, or hog stomach, was cleaned carefully, seasoned, and slow cooked until tender. Potatoes were added to the pot, soaking up the rich broth and spices as they simmered together. The result was a dish that was hearty, savory, and deeply satisfying, often eaten in large portions to provide strength before long hours in the fields or factories. Though not a delicacy, it was respected because it made use of parts of the hog that otherwise might have been discarded. The combination of meat and potatoes provided both protein and comfort, ensuring that families started their mornings with something filling. Hog maw and potatoes reflected resilience, turning less desirable cuts into meals that carried pride and tradition. Though it is rarely seen on tables today, it once served as a dependable morning staple. Carrot soufflé brought a gentle sweetness and a cloud-like texture to potluck tables, proving that vegetables could feel like dessert. Tender carrots were boiled and pureed until smooth, then folded with butter, eggs, and a hint of vanilla before being baked until puffed and golden at the edges. The result was light yet rich, with a flavor somewhere between custard and cake, making it welcome alongside savory meats or as a standalone treat. Children loved its bright color and subtle sugar, while adults admired the clever way it turned everyday produce into something elegant. Church kitchens and community halls often baked multiple pans for holiday gatherings, filling the air with a warm, comforting scent. As boxed cake mixes and pre-packaged sides became the norm, this delicate dish fell from regular rotation. Today, it lingers mostly in worn recipe cards and quiet recollections, a reminder of a time when a humble carrot could be transformed into a celebratory centerpiece through patience, shared skill, and a hot oven. Turnip green pot pie was a dish that blended creativity with thrift, transforming greens into the centerpiece of a meal. My grandmother cooked the greens down with onion and broth until tender, then poured them into a dish and covered them with pie crust or biscuit dough. As it baked, the crust turned golden and flaky, soaking in the juices of the greens below. It looked like a Sunday supper, even though it was made from humble garden vegetables. Families sliced into the pot pie and found warmth, substance, and a reminder that greens were not just a side dish, but a main course. Paired with cornbread or beans, it became a meal that stretched across households. In the 1960s, this kind of resourcefulness kept families going, proving that with care and imagination, even simple greens could feel special. Turnip green pot pie was proof that hard times did not mean giving up pride at the table. Cabbage and smoked sausage was the one-pot wonder that could feed a crowd. A single sausage link, sliced thin, was all it took to flavor an entire head of cabbage. Grandparents threw it all in a big pot with onions, pepper, and a spoon of grease. The cabbage wilted slow, its pale green turning gold in the steam. The smell filled every corner of the house, warm and inviting. Served with rice or cornbread, it made a full meal out of scraps. Each bite was smoky, sweet, and soft, the taste of making enough for everyone. It was not fancy, but it was always filling. Even when the sausage was barely there, its flavor carried through the whole dish. It was the kind of food that brought everyone to the table and kept them grateful. Wild berry dumplings were a breakfast that came directly from the land. Foraged berries like blackberries, blueberries, or mulberries were gathered in the early morning, often by children who knew where the best patches grew. The berries were simmered into a sweet syrup, and then simple dumplings made from flour and water were dropped into the pot. As they cooked, the dumplings soaked up the berry flavor, becoming plump, soft, and comforting. This was not a dish you would find in restaurants, but one that carried the taste of summer mornings in rural communities. It was affordable, relying only on what nature provided, and a handful of pantry staples. Families looked forward to it during berry season, enjoying a breakfast that blended sweetness and tradition. The dumplings were eaten straight from bowls, sometimes with a little milk poured over the top to stretch the meal further. Wild berry dumplings were proof that even foraged food could feel like a feast. Molasses brown bread, steamed in coffee cans, was a clever Yankee tradition that found a second life at Southern fundraisers and community dinners. A batter of rye flour, cornmeal, molasses, and buttermilk was poured into well-greased metal coffee cans, then set in a steaming pot where gentle heat cooked it through without drying the crumb. The finished loaf emerged dense and slightly sweet, with a moist texture that sliced beautifully and paired perfectly with baked beans or thick stews. Volunteers loved it because the recipe was inexpensive, fed a crowd, and traveled well-wrapped in cloth. Its dark aroma of molasses filled kitchens and church basements, a scent that spoke of generosity and fellowship. As commercial breads and quick loaves became easier to buy, the slow ritual of steaming bread in repurposed cans faded from daily life. Still, the memory of lifting a warm loaf from its metal mold remains a powerful image of community spirit and practical creativity. Vegetable soup with garden leftovers was a dish born from necessity and creativity. My grandmother gathered whatever vegetables were left at the end of the week, beans, carrots, peas, corn, or turnip greens, and simmered them in a pot of broth. Sometimes she added rice, pasta, or even potatoes to bulk it up, creating a soup that stretched far beyond its humble ingredients. Each pot tasted different, depending on what was on hand, but it always felt hearty and comforting. Cornbread was served alongside, crumbled into bowls to soak up every drop of broth. It was a way of cleaning out the fridge without wasting anything, a meal that proved scraps could still sustain. Families in the 1960s relied on dishes like this to carry them through lean weeks, stretching pennies into nourishment. Vegetable soup with garden leftovers was both frugal and flavorful, carrying the ingenuity of women who made sure nothing went to waste. It was survival disguised as comfort, one pot feeding many with warmth, pride, and love. Beef liver and onions were the weekday hero, the meal that fed a family for pennies. Grandparents sliced the liver thin, dredged it in flour, and seared it in a hot skillet. Onions caramelized beside it, sweet and soft, cutting the richness of the meat. The smell was deep and earthy, the taste bold and full. Served with rice or mashed potatoes, it was food that strengthened bodies and taught appreciation. Kids might wrinkle their noses, but they ate it all the same, knowing it kept them strong. Beef liver and onions were nourishment, not luxury. Honest food made with honest work. The sizzle of the pan was a sound of perseverance, of making something nourishing out of what little money could buy. Grandparents knew how long to cook it, just enough to keep it tender, never tough. A drizzle of gravy sometimes finished the dish, soaking into everything on the plate. It was hearty, iron-rich, and reliable, the taste of care disguised as simplicity. Every bite was a reminder that meals did not need to impress to matter. They only needed to sustain. Field pea cakes were one of those breakfast recipes that reflected both creativity and frugality. Leftover field peas would be mashed and mixed with cornmeal, onion, and a touch of seasoning, then shaped into patties and fried until crisp. They were simple to prepare and stretched whatever little was left from dinner into the morning meal. For farming families, peas were easy to grow and store, making them a dependable staple. The patties were hearty enough to satisfy hunger and could be eaten plain or alongside bread, syrup, or even a bit of bacon when available. The texture was soft inside with a crunchy crust that made them appealing to both children and adults. Field pea cakes spoke to the ingenuity of cooks who made sure nothing went to waste. They were not just thrifty, but also delicious, proving that even the simplest ingredients could be turned into a breakfast worth remembering. Rice and molasses supper was one of the simplest meals, but also one of the most remembered. A pot of rice was inexpensive, filling, and always on hand, but paired with a drizzle of molasses, it turned into something sweet and sustaining. Sugar was too costly for everyday use, but molasses was affordable and sold in larger tins that seemed to last forever. Families poured it over steaming bowls of rice, letting the dark syrup seep into the grains until they gleamed. The taste was rich, almost smoky, with just enough sweetness to make children smile. It was often eaten at the end of the day when no meat could be spared, and it carried people through the night with enough strength to face the next morning. My grandmother told me rice and molasses was a treat disguised as necessity, proof that resourcefulness could soften the edge of scarcity. In the 1960s, when Black families were stretching every dollar, rice and molasses kept hunger at bay while still offering a touch of comfort. Simple, cheap, and unforgettable, it was a meal born of need but remembered with love. Soot biscuits were the kind of food you learned to trust when the fire was all you had. They were baked in soot-covered Dutch ovens, set right into the coals until the smell of toasted flour filled the air. The outsides came out black and charred, but inside they were soft, warm, and sweet from the faint taste of smoke. You brushed off the ash and split them open, steam rising like a small blessing. They were eaten with syrup, molasses, or even gravy if the morning allowed it. Families traveling, camping, or working the land knew this trick well. It was food that came straight from the earth and fire, raw and honest. Soot biscuits did not look like much, but they carried pride. They were proof that comfort could come from the simplest effort, that even ashes could feed the body and soothe the soul. The smell lingered on your hands and clothes, a reminder that good things sometimes came wrapped in smoke. Each bite tasted like work and gratitude, the flavor of survival baked in real flame. Pumpkin stew with onions was the kind of dish that proved homegrown vegetables could anchor a meal. Pumpkins were easy to plant, easy to store, and yielded enough flesh to keep a family fed for weeks. My grandmother peeled chunks of pumpkin, cooked them down with onions, and let the pot simmer until it turned thick and savory. The sweetness of the pumpkin mixed with the sharpness of onion, creating a balance that felt hearty and satisfying. Sometimes she added a little pepper or a leftover bone for extra flavor, but even plain, the stew was filling. Served with bread or cornbread, it was enough to feed a household without meat or costly ingredients. In the 1960s, pumpkins were not just for pies or holidays. They were staples, pulled from backyard gardens and turned into supper. The stew carried warmth, thrift, and creativity in every spoonful. Pumpkin stew with onions showed that survival did not mean going without taste, only learning to love what the land gave freely. Blackberry molasses cobbler was a sticky, smoky dessert that belonged to cast-iron skillets and long summer nights. The berries were gathered wild from fence lines and hedges, their juice staining fingers and laughter alike. Mixed with thick, dark molasses and a handful of sugar, they turned into a bubbling, fragrant filling. The crust was poured over top, sometimes biscuit dough, sometimes batter, and baked until the edges burned just enough to taste like smoke. It was messy and imperfect, but that was part of its beauty. The syrup thickened into a glossy black glaze that clung to every bite, sweet with a whisper of bitterness. People spooned it hot into bowls, sometimes with milk or cream, but it never needed help. Blackberry molasses cobbler tasted like work and reward, like something earned under the sun. It was the dessert that reminded families that sweetness could survive the hardest days, that joy could bubble up even from thorns. Sweet corn and onion skillet was the kind of dish that came together quickly, made from what the garden and pantry had to offer. Fresh ears of corn, or sometimes canned when the season had passed, were sliced from the cob and tossed into a hot pan with sliced onions. Lard or bacon fat did the work of bringing flavor, sizzling until the onions browned and the corn caramelized. The smell was sweet and smoky, filling the house with a promise of comfort even before the first bite. It was cheap, it was fast, and it was nourishing, the kind of supper that stretched across countless families trying to make ends meet. My grandmother served it with bread or cornbread, letting the skillet's juices soak into every bite. The simplicity was its strength, just vegetables and fat, transformed into something more than the sum of its parts. Sweet corn and onion skillet reminded everyone that even with little, you could still eat well. Fried green tomatoes with grits was a cheap Southern classic that carried both tradition and thrift in every bite. Unripe tomatoes, plucked before they spoiled, were sliced, dredged in cornmeal, and fried until golden in a skillet of hot oil or bacon fat. My grandmother paired them with bowls of creamy grits, the cornmeal base that stretched across countless households for pennies. The tomatoes were tangy and crisp, the grits soft and warm, creating a contrast that satisfied both hunger and taste. It was food that came straight from the garden and pantry, without needing costly additions. Families ate it often in the summer when tomatoes grew in abundance, but it found its way to the table year-round. The combination of fried green tomatoes with grits represented resilience, resourcefulness, and the comfort of tradition. In the 1960s, this meal stood as proof that good food did not depend on wealth, but on knowing how to use what you had wisely. Ham bone soup with vegetables was one of those meals where one piece of meat flavored an entire pot. A single ham bone, stripped of most of its meat, simmered for hours with onions, carrots, and potatoes until the broth turned rich and smoky. My grandmother would add beans or greens if she had them, letting the flavors meld into something far more substantial than the ingredients suggested. Families gathered around steaming bowls, dipping bread into the broth and savoring the flavor the bone had left behind. It was frugal cooking at its finest, taking scraps and stretching them into nourishment. The soup fed many mouths, warmed cold nights, and made do with what was available. In the 1960s, when meat was costly, a ham bone could be the centerpiece of dinner, proving that thrift and patience could coax flavor out of nearly anything. Ham bone soup with vegetables carried both practicality and comfort in every ladleful. Turnip green pot pie was a dish that blended creativity with thrift, transforming greens into the centerpiece of a meal. My grandmother cooked the greens down with onion and broth until tender, then poured them into a dish and covered them with pie crust or biscuit dough. As it baked, the crust turned golden and flaky, soaking in the juices of the greens below. It looked like a Sunday supper, even though it was made from humble garden vegetables. Families sliced into the pot pie and found warmth, substance, and a reminder that greens were not just a side dish, but a main course. Paired with cornbread or beans, it became a meal that stretched across households. In the 1960s, this kind of resourcefulness kept families going, proving that with care and imagination, even simple greens could feel special. Turnip green pot pie was proof that hard times did not mean giving up pride at the table. Stewed chicken backs were one of those meals that turned scraps into sustenance. In the 1960s, the back of the chicken was considered the cheapest cut, with little meat clinging to the bones. My grandmother bought them in bulk, cleaned them, and simmered them for hours with onions, potatoes, and carrots until the broth grew rich and fragrant. The long cooking softened the bits of meat so they slid easily from the bones, creating a meal that was both filling and flavorful. Families served the stew over rice or with cornbread, stretching the broth even further. The dish carried smoky undertones if she added a ham bone or a splash of fatback, but it was nourishing even without extras. What made it memorable was how something so overlooked could still feel satisfying and dignified at the table. Stewed chicken backs reminded families that nothing should be wasted, and even the smallest scraps could anchor a full dinner. It was a meal of patience, thrift, and creativity, proof that the cheapest part of the bird could still feed a household with warmth and pride. Roe sacks were cleaned and seasoned, then pan-fried in lard or butter until firm and golden. Onions were fried alongside, adding sweetness and balancing the rich flavor of the roe. The combination was eaten hot, often with bread or cornbread, creating a meal that was hearty and protein-rich. It was not a glamorous dish, but it was reliable and nutritious, making it an important breakfast in households that lived close to waterways. Roe was affordable compared to other proteins, and using it showed the resourcefulness of cooks who relied on what was readily available. Though not common today, fish roe and onions once held a respected place at the table, carrying both sustenance and tradition. Hot water cornbread and fried fish scraps were one of the most inventive pairings my grandmother served. Hot water cornbread was made quickly, mixing cornmeal with boiling water and frying it into golden patties that crisped beautifully on the outside. It was fast, cheap, and filling, the kind of bread that appeared often at the table. To go with it, she fried scraps of fish, tails, heads, or thin trimmings left over from larger catches. What some saw as waste became supper, seasoned and fried until crispy. The two together made a meal that cost almost nothing but filled everyone at the table. The cornbread carried smoky richness, while the fish scraps provided flavor and protein. It was food that came from resourcefulness, proof that nothing was discarded if it could be eaten. Hot water cornbread and fried fish scraps carried the legacy of thrift, turning overlooked parts into a dinner that felt whole. Families remembered these meals not just for their flavor, but for their lesson in survival. Homemade vegetable soup was a patchwork of everything left behind. Grandparents threw together wilted greens, carrot ends, onion skins, and any leftover meat bones into a single pot. Water turned to broth as it simmered, slowly pulling life from scraps. The smell was clean and comforting, like the promise of one more good meal. Sometimes rice or noodles joined in, stretching it further. Every spoonful tasted different. Some bites rich with beans, others bright with tomato or herbs. The soup was never the same twice, but it was always satisfying. It was the kitchen's way of saying nothing goes to waste, everything has purpose. Served hot on cold nights, it filled not just the stomach, but the spirit. Homemade vegetable soup was the flavor of perseverance, a quiet declaration that hunger could always be met with creativity, care, and community, one steaming bowl at a time. Hickory nut milk delivered rich nutrition from the forests when dairy was limited or unavailable. Hickory nuts were cracked and pounded into a fragrant paste, then steeped in hot water and strained to produce a creamy liquid full of natural oils and protein. This drink could be enjoyed warm as a morning beverage or used to enrich cornbread and porridges, offering sustenance without reliance on cow's milk. The technique drew directly from indigenous American practices, which African cooks learned and adapted to their own needs. Hickory trees were plentiful across the Southeast, ensuring a steady supply for those willing to gather and crack the tough shells. Even after emancipation, rural families continued making hickory milk for special dishes, and some Appalachian recipes still call for it today. Its smooth flavor and nourishing qualities illustrate how African American cooks combined local knowledge and Old World methods to create foods of lasting value. Hickory nut milk stands as a quiet but powerful symbol of ingenuity, linking the forest's bounty to a tradition of resilience and culinary skill. Canned sardine grits bowls were a dish for days when the cupboard seemed empty, but the will to eat well remained strong. Grandparents opened the tin, the sharp, salty scent of sardines hitting first. They fried the fish lightly in the skillet with onions or peppers if they had them, crisping the edges until golden. Meanwhile, a pot of grits bubbled on the stove, thick and smooth, stirred with a heavy hand to keep it from sticking. The two came together in a bowl, grits soft and buttery beneath, sardines rich and smoky on top. Hot sauce was often the final touch, adding just enough heat to balance the salt. It was a poor man's meal with a rich man's satisfaction, a combination that made sense only to those who had lived it. For many families, it was breakfast, dinner, and survival, proof that pride and creativity never left the kitchen, no matter how hard times got. Pork fatback and cabbage was a skillet dish that showed how even scraps of pork could bring life to vegetables. Fatback, mostly fat with little meat, rendered down in a hot pan until it sizzled, releasing flavor into the cabbage. My grandmother would slice the cabbage thin and cook it until tender, soaking up the richness from the fat. The result was savory, smoky, and filling, even though it was made from ingredients most considered cheap or undesirable. Families paired it with cornbread or rice, stretching it further into a full supper. It was food that came from thrift, but it carried a taste that lingered long after the plates were cleared. In the 1960s, fatback and cabbage was a reminder that flavor did not come from abundance, but from knowing how to cook with care. It was a dish that taught respect for every part of the animal and every leaf from the garden. Pork, fatback, and cabbage turned scraps into sustenance. Collard green potlikker soup was proof that nothing in the kitchen went to waste. After collard greens were boiled with ham hocks or smoked meat, the leftover broth was packed with nutrients and flavor. Families would save it, thicken it with beans, rice, or cornbread crumbs, and serve it as a soup. It turned what could have been discarded liquid into a meal that could stretch for days. Potlikker was praised for its richness and vitamins, especially during times when fresh vegetables were limited. Black families in the South cherished it as part of their food culture, a reminder that even scraps held value. The taste of potlikker soup was smoky, salty, and comforting, carrying both sustenance and heritage in every bowl. It reminded people that resourcefulness was a form of survival and strength. For many households, it was a dish that fed both body and spirit when times were most difficult. Cabbage and potato hash made vegetables taste like victory. Grandparents diced cabbage thin and cut potatoes thick, tossing them together in a skillet slick with bacon grease. The sound of sizzling filled the room, the smell of pepper and salt pulling everyone closer. The cabbage softened while the potatoes browned, the two becoming inseparable in flavor. It was hearty enough to be supper and simple enough to be breakfast the next morning. Sometimes onions or a bit of leftover sausage found their way in, but it never needed much to shine. The magic was in the texture, crispy edges giving way to soft centers, each bite earthy and warm. It was a one-pan wonder that stretched groceries and spirits alike. No waste, no worry, just food that filled the stomach and soothed the soul. It reminded everyone that plenty was not about money but about knowing how to make something out of nearly nothing. Pumpkin cornbread pancakes were a seasonal breakfast that brought warmth and flavor to the table while also highlighting the importance of harvest traditions. Pumpkin puree was mixed into cornmeal batter, creating pancakes that were tender, slightly sweet, and spiced with cinnamon or nutmeg when available. They were cooked on hot griddles, often in heavy cast-iron pans, filling kitchens with the rich scent of autumn mornings and harvest season comfort. Served with syrup, molasses, or even a small pat of butter, they were both filling and affordable, making them a treasured staple in many homes. Pumpkins were easy to grow in gardens and easy to store through winter, making them a natural addition to recipes when fresh produce was scarce. Cornmeal, a constant in African American kitchens, stretched the batter and made the pancakes accessible to families of every size. Children especially looked forward to these pancakes, as they added color and flavor to the usual breakfast fare. Pumpkin cornbread pancakes carried tradition, thrift, and creativity, turning everyday ingredients into something that felt festive and memorable. They were a reminder of how seasons shaped the table and how families found joy in simple shared meals that carried both memory and resilience. Sorghum syrup biscuits with milk were the kind of dinner that showed how families found sweetness even in struggle. Sorghum syrup, cheaper than sugar, was kept in jars that seemed to last forever, poured generously over hot biscuits fresh from the oven. My grandmother baked the biscuits with flour and lard, ingredients that could be stretched and shared across multiple meals. Once the biscuits were ready, she split them open, drizzled them with syrup, and served them with cold milk poured into glasses. It was simple but filling, providing enough energy for tired workers and growing children. The sweetness of the syrup turned plain flour biscuits into something that felt like a treat, even if it was just supper. In the 1960s, this kind of meal reminded families that comfort did not always need meat or elaborate dishes. It was about making do with what was on hand and finding joy in it. Sorghum syrup biscuits with milk were a reminder that sweetness could soften the edge of hardship. Stewed okra and tomatoes were the kind of dish that took simple garden produce and turned it into something nourishing enough to feed a family. Okra, a vegetable with African origins, thrived in southern soil, while tomatoes grew easily in backyard gardens. Together, simmered slowly with onions, spices, and sometimes a scrap of salt pork, they created a stew that was tangy, savory, and thick. Families relied on it because it stretched small harvests into larger meals, often served over rice or with cornbread to make it filling. The dish was especially important when meat was too expensive to buy, as it added depth and nutrition without needing animal protein. Stewed okra and tomatoes became more than food. They were a way to survive with what the land provided. For many, the taste carried reminders of summer gardens and the hard work it took to keep families fed. It was frugal, delicious, and a perfect example of survival cooking. Stewed pig ears and beans were the taste of memory, slow cooked until soft and rich. Grandparents boiled the ears first to clean them, then simmered them with beans, onions, and garlic for hours. The broth grew thick and flavorful, the beans soaking up every drop of smoky essence. A little hot sauce or vinegar added brightness at the end. It was food that tested patience but rewarded it deeply. Each bite was tender, savory, and layered with history. What others saw as scraps, families saw as sustenance, a connection to generations that made survival a craft. Served with rice or bread, it filled the table with warmth and gratitude. Stewed pig ears and beans were a lesson in respect, for food, for work, for what came before. Every bowl reminded people that nothing was ever wasted when cooked with heart. It was the past kept alive through flavor and faith. Wild grape connected plantation kitchens to the native abundance of the American South. Muscadine and scuppernong grapes grew untended along fences and forest edges, providing a dependable late summer harvest. Enslaved workers gathered the clusters and crushed them by hand to create a tangy juice that could be fermented slightly for a refreshing drink or boiled into a syrupy must used to season grains and greens. This technique echoed West African traditions of using fruit reductions to brighten savory dishes. After emancipation, muscadine wine and homemade grape jellies became hallmarks of Southern foodways, and small farms still produce them today. The careful gathering and slow simmering required patience and skill, qualities that defined the cooking of those who made the most of every wild resource. Wild grape must stand as both a practical recipe and a testament to how African American cooks merged Old World techniques with New World ingredients, leaving a flavor that continues to shape regional preserves and beverages across the Carolinas and Georgia. Chinquapin nut cakes offered small moments of sweetness created from the rich forests of the American South. The chinquapin, a dwarf chestnut native to the region, produced small, sweet nuts that could be eaten raw or roasted. Enslaved families collected these nuts in autumn, cracked their shells, and ground the meat into a fine meal. Mixed with a little cornmeal, honey, or molasses when available, the nut meal formed small cakes that were baked or cooked on a griddle until golden brown. These cakes carried both nutrition and a sense of celebration, providing rare treats for special gatherings. The flavor, slightly sweeter than a chestnut with a buttery finish, became a cherished memory passed down through generations. Even after emancipation, chinquapin nuts remained a prized wild harvest in Appalachian and Southern communities, though the trees have grown scarce in modern times. Chinquapin nut cakes remind us of the connection between forest abundance and human creativity, transforming a foraged ingredient into a dessert that honored both the landscape and the people who carefully tended its secrets. Sorrel hibiscus tea brought a ruby glow to church socials and summer porch gatherings. Its tart floral flavor, steeped from dried hibiscus petals and sweetened with cane sugar, reflected Caribbean influences that African American families carried north and west during migrations. Grandmothers brewed the tea in large enamel pots, sometimes adding a hint of ginger or a squeeze of lime to brighten the taste. Children watched the deep red liquid swirl into pitchers, knowing it signaled a special occasion. Served chilled over cracked ice in simple glasses, sorrel tea cooled guests during humid evenings while hymns and laughter filled the air. The drink offered more than refreshment. It was a quiet connection to ancestors and homelands across the sea. Over time, soda and store-bought beverages replaced the careful steeping of petals and spices, and the vibrant tradition faded in many communities. Those who still make it treasure the deep crimson reminder of resilience and shared history that once colored every celebration. Navy bean and ham soup was the taste of patience and thrift wrapped in warmth. Grandparents started with a leftover ham bone, letting it simmer low until every bit of flavor seeped into the pot. Dried navy beans soaked overnight, softening in water before joining the bubbling broth. The smell filled the house, rich and smoky, carrying the promise of comfort. Onions, celery, and carrots followed, chopped fine and stirred in slowly. The soup thickened as the beans broke down, turning creamy without needing milk or cream. A pinch of salt, a dash of pepper, and sometimes a splash of vinegar completed the work. Every spoonful tasted like effort rewarded, like turning scraps into something generous. The ham bone gave more than meat. It gave depth, heart, and memory. Served with cornbread or crackers, it was a meal that stretched for days. It was humble but mighty, a pot that represented everything right about Southern kitchens. Resourcefulness, care, and love passed from hand to hand, meal to meal. Dandelion green hash was a breakfast that showed the importance of foraging and making use of what the land offered. Dandelion greens, often dismissed as weeds, were gathered fresh and sautéed with onions in a skillet until tender. Potatoes or eggs were sometimes added when available, stretching the dish into something more filling. The greens had a slightly bitter flavor that balanced with the sweetness of onions and the richness of whatever fat was used for cooking. For families with little money, dandelion green hash provided vitamins, comfort, and a hot plate of food without requiring much expense. It carried tradition too, as elders passed down the knowledge of which wild plants could be eaten and how to prepare them. Children might not have loved the bitterness, but they grew up with it as part of their everyday lives. Dandelion green hash was more than thrift. It was a reminder that resilience often comes straight from the soil. Cornmeal-crusted fried pork chops were a celebration of texture and taste. Grandparents dredged the chops in seasoned cornmeal, pressing it tight before dropping them into bubbling grease. The sizzle was loud and promising, the smell enough to make mouths water across the house. The crust turned golden and crisp, the meat inside juicy and tender. Each chop came out shining with pride, ready to be served beside mashed potatoes or collard greens. The first bite crackled, then melted into pure comfort. Even when meat was rare, this dish made dinner feel abundant. It was a meal of love, labor, and satisfaction, the kind that made families linger at the table long after the plates were empty. Cornmeal-crusted fried pork chops were proof that good food was not about wealth, but about will, about taking what you had and making it beautiful. It was soul food in every sense of the word. Stewed field peas with cornbread was a Southern staple that seemed to appear on tables no matter how hard times got. Field peas were inexpensive, easy to grow, and dried well enough to last through seasons, making them a dependable ingredient when other food was scarce. My grandmother simmered them slowly with onion, maybe a scrap of pork if any was left, until the peas broke down into a thick, savory stew. Cornbread was baked alongside, crumbly and warm, and served as the perfect companion, soaking up every bit of broth. Together they made a full meal, packed with enough substance to keep workers fed after long days in the fields or factories. Field peas were humble compared to black-eyed peas or butter beans, but they carried a taste of the land, earthy and comforting. For families with little money to spare, this pairing was dependable, stretching across generations as a dish of both necessity and pride. Stewed field peas with cornbread filled stomachs, warmed hearts, and reminded everyone that simple food could still be good food. Which secret recipe did your mother finally pass down to you? Share your story in the comments, hit that like button, and subscribe so we can keep uncovering these hidden kitchen treasures.